do you agree that it's completely homophobic to stop your children being told about the existence of gay people? I do. I don't know what other reason you probably could have. Did you see the, I think it was an imam from one of the Birmingham mosques discussing it, saying it's not homophobic. I don't know if you saw that on the news this week. He's not homophobic. He just doesn't want children of that age to hear that it's morally acceptable to be gay. Oh, not homophobic, though. I mean, I cannot think of another minority that would have to listen to this claptrap on national television. I really can't.
So I'm a conservative evangelical Christian, and I also earned my PhD in theology, so I have taught college for 3 years. But I oppose the idea of using public school to teach children how to engage in homosexual activity, and that is an issue we've had in the Colorado legislature. There's a bill here to promote LGBT lessons to children against the consent of their parents, and I think this is wrong. I oppose the legislation here for 4 different reasons.
Okay, well, let's get to those reasons in just a moment. But just to correct you, and I don't know what is being proposed over there, but certainly here in the United Kingdom, it is merely within the bigger context of equality and within the bigger context of other particular minorities needing to be, I guess, acknowledged in order so that people can live perhaps a little bit more equally going forward. So in the context of that, LGBT existence is one of the areas that children are told about. So it's not sort of about teaching them about engaging in LGBT relationships. It's simply an acknowledgement that some LGBT people exist, some LGBT people might be parents. Indeed, there are LGBT parents at the very school where these lessons are taking place. And so it's in the wider context of celebrating all different people's kinds of diversity. So that's what's being proposed over here. Presumably in that context, that's something you're still against, and you'll give me your reasons why.
Yes. Well, there are legal reasons, of course. Unless you believe that adults should be having sexual relations with children, then you would be opposed to laws that violate what we call the age of majority or age of consent, that only consenting adults, but not children, should be pressured to engage in that kind of activity. And of course, it violates parental rights. A parent should be the one to decide when it's age appropriate for their children to learn about these things, not the government and not some stranger in public school. There are also scientific and biological reasons. If you have studied biology, as most Americans do in high school, and for example, Mendelian genetics or Punnett squares, you'll observe that if a man with blue eyes mates with a woman who has blue eyes, increased chance their children will have blue eyes. Same thing with brown hair. If a man has brown hair, his wife has brown hair, the children might have brown hair. But there's nearly 100% chance that if a homosexual man mates with another homosexual man, they will not have children. And so the only way to continue to propagate their same kind is to recruit the children of heterosexual couples. And so there is a recruiting effort, unfortunately, that is violating the safety of children. And I think when they promote that in public schools, it, I suppose, violates the innocence of that child and persuades them to be something they were not created by God to be in the first place.
I'm sorry, recruiting of children. I don't quite understand what you mean by that. So, and say that there's an LGBT couple in the community where there is a school. You think that LGBT couple will be, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you think perhaps that LGBT couple will be wanting schools to mention the existence of LGBT couples like themselves because that will, to use your words, recruit children to be gay themselves?
Well, it's about teaching children what is morally right and wrong in some senses. There are safety concerns. For example, here in America, when they recruit, just talk about the T in LGBT, when they tell children, oh, you can pretend to be a girl even if you're biologically a boy and still have boy parts. What this creates in public schools is a safety problem in public school bathrooms or co-ed locker rooms where boys are violating the privacy of little girls.
When has that happened?
Oh, it's happened repeatedly here in America.
Can you
I don't
give
know
me
what
some
happens over there.
examples of that happening? Because overwhelmingly the evidence here in the United Kingdom is that mixed gender bathrooms, and there have been a couple of isolated cases among adults where there have been very, very minority cases where something has gone wrong. But certainly the evidence over here is that actually it doesn't have any kind of effect whatsoever. And I mean, that's getting onto the trans debate, which of course is extremely important. But can you explain to me what you mean by safety concerns? About what safety concern? This is what I want to get to the bottom of.
When you teach a child that they can foster these thoughts, for example, of transgender transformation of themselves, the way you harm them psychologically is to plant a seed of self-doubt about their identity. If they were born to be a boy, now they're doubting themselves, and that self-doubt leads to self-hatred, which leads to self-mutilation. They begin themselves, or maybe have some kind of surgery, and it leads to self-murder. 40% of transgendered individuals will attempt suicide at some point in their life.
But of course they would, because of people, unfortunately, like yourself, who thinks that it's mutilation, who thinks that someone would make the decision one day. Well, firstly, you are confusing sexuality and gender. They are both different things, firstly, and so I don't think you can lump gender in with the conversation that we're having about the different kinds of sexual orientations that there are, firstly. But secondly, of course, people who are perhaps trans or perhaps members of the LGBT community, of course, by the time they reach adulthood, they're going to feel isolated. They're going to feel like people don't understand. And there'll be a number of reasons of that. Firstly, it will be the kind of, with respect, bigotry that you are spouting, suggesting that it's self-mutilation, suggesting you have more than once brought up in the context of children being taught about equality. You started talking about child abusers, which, by the way, as a member of the LGBT community, I actually find quite offensive. But not only will they have to be facing your kind of prejudice themselves, but aside from that, they will obviously not be able to know that they are not alone, because by the time they reach adulthood, if they've never heard about any of these issues before, which, by the way, would be in them to start with, they wouldn't learn them by hearing about them. Of course, by the time they reach adulthood, they're going to feel isolated, they're going to feel sad, they're going to feel depressed. Why don't people like you perhaps try and understand how they've got to that stage rather than writing them off or discussing child abusers in the same context?
Well, as a counselor who has treated people in this condition, I have found that truth therapy is better than lying about your self-identity or lying to a young person about their confusion. Gender dysphoria is still listed in the DSM-4 Psychological Manual of Disorders here in America. I'm sure you have something like that over there. But
yeah, though there's a big debate over here about self-identification, which is something that is now, because over here you do need to live in that gender for a certain amount of time and then have a medical assessment in order to identify. What is happening at the moment is that there is a consultation on legislation that means that people can self-identify. Now, okay, before we get to all of that, can I just ask, though, what is the problem with... And I kind of actually have sympathy with someone who would say, well, hang on, I don't want a child to be hearing about the ins and outs of people who perhaps have gender dysphoria because it's a bit too advanced for a child. Or I can understand a parent saying, look, I don't want the ins and outs of gay relationships discussed with children, because, to be honest, I completely get that. I understand that would be a parental decision to make. But what would be the problem in just mentioning, in the context of equality, just the mere existence, i.e., some people have a mummy and daddy. Some people, children, have a mummy and mummy. And that's it. Nothing more. No more detail. In the same way that I would point to a postbox and say, look, a postbox exists. A blue sky exists. A cloud exists. Two mummies or two daddies exist. It is merely mentioning the existence.
Well, I think it's the first step in a long line of arguments, and they always want more, right? It's the argument of the camel's nose under the tent. You should have swatted the camel's nose before the entire camel is inside of the tent, and then you would never have the problems with child abuse. As a man of faith, as a man of compassion...
Can you stop mentioning child abuse in the context of LGBT people, please? Can you stop mentioning child abuse in the context of LGBT people, please?
Well, I think there ought to be protections for children. We're not talking about consenting adults. You brought up the topic of whether or not children should be exposed to this. And I, as a man of faith...
It's not radiation. It's not radiation. Exposed. It's not radiation. It's not an airborne virus. It is a mere existence of the LGBT community. That's it.
Well, I happen to be an ordained minister, and I recall that Jesus said this in the Bible in Luke 17. He said, if anyone causes one of these little ones to sin, it'd be better if you had a millstone hung around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. So Jesus is very much against child abusers because he wants to protect the innocence of children and protect their safety, protect their sanctity, their innocence.
Can you explain what that's got to do with LGBT people being mentioned to children? Because again, you've made the connection to child abusers there. You do know that there are people who are, in fact, the majority of people who are child abusers are actually heterosexual, and usually it's within the family environment that child abuse takes place. So mentioning the existence of different kinds of relationships to children, again, I don't see a connection with child abuse, unless, of course, you're going to acknowledge the amount of child abuse that takes place in heterosexual families, which, of course, is the majority.
Well, you know, when a child is 5 or 6 years old, they're still developing an idea, trying to understand what a friend is like, much less a sexual kind of relationship. Shouldn't that be reserved for when they're closer to puberty or closer to adulthood? I don't think we should be pushing these on 5 and 6 year old children.
So do you discuss
the moral values of the parents when the children are away from the parents and they're in a public school? The government should not be the one promoting these things without parental consent.
So when you or when anyone discusses, if you had a 5 or 6 year old niece, nephew, son, daughter, I'm not sure, but if you had a child, perhaps someone that you taught who was 5 or 6 years old, if they were to ask if you were married, for instance, you know, are you someone who has a wife, for instance, would you go into the intimacies and the express details of your sexual relationship with your wife with that child? Or would you simply say, yes, I'm married and her name is whatever her name is? Or would you say to the child, well, yes, I'm married and actually this is how we have sex and this is how we procreate and this is the intimacies of our relationship and I feel like I should tell you that?
Well, if it was my child, I would teach the child that marriage is as God defined in Genesis between one man and one woman, as Jesus said in Matthew 19.
So you wouldn't go into sexual details?
I would say that a man and a woman can make a baby. I think it's appropriate to teach young children without sexual details, of course, that marriage is something designed by God, and men and women should be married, and that men and men should not be married. I think you can teach a child at a very young age that there are morally appropriate right and wrong boundaries as our Creator designed us.
You would teach your child to be prejudiced towards other people. That's essentially what you're teaching them by saying to them...
I think the natural law, if you don't want to use a biblical response, you can point to natural law and natural biology and say that, an egg and a sperm and form a zygote. If you want to eventually get, when they reach the age of understanding sexuality, and that a sperm and a sperm do not make a child. I think this is natural law that we're talking about, and our Creator designed us this way for whatever His reasons.
So presumably you're against heterosexual couples who are infertile being able to enjoy a loving relationship with each other because, of course, without the procreation side of things, their marriage would be pretty pointless.
Well, that's not true. The Bible says the marriage bed alone is undefiled. So there is, if you're asking me about...
Can I ask, have you any opinions that aren't based on the Bible and just based on people being equal and people being told about the existence of others without any kind of prejudicial slant? I mean, again, during this conversation, you yourself, and I know you have discussed it in the context of a religious belief, but you've on multiple occasions compared the existence of LGBT people to child abusers. You have mentioned how it really is only men and women that you feel is the kind of relationship that a child should hear about. I mean, that's all prejudice. That's all really, if anything else, just really unkind.
Well, as you recall, when I started this interview, I told you there were 4 basic arguments. And the first one I gave was a legal argument for parental rights. The second was a scientific argument that was based on biology. The third was a public safety argument about protecting children from self-harm and self-murder. And the last was a moral argument. So you asked, is the biblical argument the only one I made today? No, it was the last one I made, but it was only one of 4 arguments that I made for my position.
So public safety being the one, and of course morality being the last one. If it was proven that actually discussing the existence of LGBT people to children, if it was proven that that would actually lead to children harming themselves less as teenagers and leading to less suicide and the like, presumably, bearing in mind that's a big concern of yours, you would change your stance.
Except that the science is against you, because 40% of transgendered individuals will attempt suicide, and that's not.
I know, but we've never actually tried talking about them, though. You're basing those statistics on nothing changing. You're basing those statistics on transgender people never hearing about others.
Well, if you've studied psychology and the treatments that are available to people with gender dysphoria, you'll begin with the mind, and the psychology and the way of healing their mind is to speak truth to them so that they don't engage in self-doubt, which leads to self-hatred, which leads to self-cutting, which leads to self-murder.
And do you believe that a religious...
always deadly.
And do you believe that if you were to tell a child that it would be wrong to be in a relationship with someone of the same gender when they're older, do you believe that telling them that based on a religious belief, do you think that's truth? Do you see that as telling the child the truth?
Well, as I said, there are natural law arguments that our founding fathers in America believed. I don't know what they used to teach in Oxford, but I think natural law is, a scientific and ethically based, reasonable argument apart from Scripture. I think there are ways to approach these things, but what you're suggesting is that just by telling people of the existence of 2 men being married or 2 men being homosexuals, just by telling them of the existence, that you can deny the sexual aspect of their identities. And you can just tell them, oh, those are 2 friends. Well, I have many male friends.
No, you just say that they're in a relationship with each other. That's it. Well, I return back to my other point then. Why do you attach a sexual element to telling a child about a relationship? You wouldn't do that in a heterosexual relationship. You wouldn't say, my brother is marrying this lovely lady over here. Oh, they're going to be at it later. You would simply just say they're in a relationship with each other. Why, when it comes to the mentioning the existence of LGBT people, do you add a sexual element and think that you need to because I'm sorry, you're doing that so that you can then come up with a reason which no one unreasonable.
If I were going to talk about 2 men, I would say they are just good friends. So it's
that's a lie. That's a lie.
That. When you say that it's homosexual, you are the one introducing sexuality into it. I would just say they're 2 men who are good friends.
Well, we don't even need to use the word homosexual. You could say the word that they're in a relationship with each other. When my godchildren found out, my godchildren were never even actually told that I am gay. Do you know that? My godchildren, of which there are many, just know that Uncle Cristo has goes out with a guy called Carl, Uncle Carl, and Auntie Rebecca has a husband called Uncle Jason. It's would you like a biscuit? I mean, that is about as complicated as the conversation needs to be. And do you know what that means? It means if any of my godchildren or anyone that has encountered me and my partner, if in years to come they do, in their teenage years, realise that perhaps they are attracted to people of the same gender, because it will be then that really that will come out.
Attracted how? Well, attracted as two men who go to a football match together. That's just a friendship.
No,
but
a
if
sexual
you say
attraction.
Sexually attracted, then you're the one introducing the sexuality.
No, because if you'd listened, I actually just said, if then in their teenage years they realise that they have an attraction to someone of the same gender, perhaps having encountered people in relationships with the same gender, perhaps having heard about the fact that those people are valid, are as equal as the rest of society, perhaps hearing about that will mean that by the time they're in their teenage years, they won't think, my God, I'm different to everyone else. They won't think, wow, I need to hurt myself, I need to harm myself because I have nowhere to turn because I feel different to everyone else. Now, what is staggering to me is, as someone who claims to be sort of loving based on a religious belief, you would deny someone the good mental health, and you would deny a child feeling good about themselves as a teenager based on your own prejudices, because there is nothing that has proven that simply telling a child that a gay relationship exists with no further detail, there is nothing to prove that that is harmful. You can come up with rhetoric about child abuse, you can come up with rhetoric that the child will be told something sexual. That's rubbish, and you know it. You use that kind of rhetoric in order to justify the prejudice that you are peddling, when you know full well that a child being told that there is a gay uncle with his friend, that's not going to harm that child in the slightest. You know that deep down.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to agree to disagree about that. I think it is inherently harmful to teach a child to sin. And as Jesus said, when adults approach children and they recruit them into sin, it's bad for the child, but it's worse for the adult, because the adult will face judgment for violating the innocence of the child.
And do you, just finally, do you believe that if a child hears about the fact that gay people exist, like I said, no further detail, just the fact that they exist, do you...
But you introduced the word gay when you said that, so it implies some kind of sexuality. If you were to
really?
just tell a child that two men are friends and they're going to a football match, there's no sexuality implied.
But you just gave me with respect, you just gave me a rather pious speech about honesty, and now you're saying that we should lie to children and say that they're just friends. You just told me I believe in honesty and I believe in the word being honest. Well, now you're saying we should lie to children and say that they're just two friends.
You're going to tell a 5 or 6-year-old child of a heterosexual couple that is not your child that this homosexual relationship should be accepted. You're the one introducing the sexuality to the 5 or 6-year-old
because
child.
I would never discuss it. I would never discuss sexuality with a child because, well, firstly, I find that a bit weird. Actually, the thought that you keep returning to the fact that there has to be some sort of sexual element to this conversation when there doesn't, I find that actually quite strange, because I'll return to the point.
Read them books.
I will return to the point. If a child said, Who is Grandad Chaps married to? You would simply say, oh, he's married to Auntie Janet or Auntie Sarah or whomever it is that you happen to be married to, and that's it. Now, you wouldn't say he's married to Auntie Sarah and, oh, they have an amazing sexual relationship and, oh, they are going to be having a baby together, unlike the sexual relationship of their gay friends down the road. Of course you wouldn't discuss that with a child, and you know full well.
If I were talking to a child about, let's say, a neighbor and a gay relationship, I wouldn't talk about gay. I wouldn't talk about the relationship. I wouldn't talk about sex. I would just say, oh, those two men are friends.
Well, so you'd lie.
That's how I
you'd
would
lie
say.
to the child. You'd lie.
Well, it's better. It's omitting things that are waiting until they're age appropriate to talk about sexuality.
Well, you're not talking about. You don't need to wait again.
You're the one who talks about sexuality to 5 and 6 year old children.
No, you're the one who keeps bringing up the sexuality element. If you were to say to a child, that's Uncle Cristo, and he's in a relationship with Uncle Carl, that's it. That's all you need to say. I don't believe the child would ask any sexual questions. And if you're going to offer any kind of sexual detail, well, then I think that's the problem for an adult. No child needs to hear about any kind of elements of the sexuality and the sexual side of things. Let's cut to the quick here. You believe...
On that we agree.
Well, then stop mentioning the sexual side of things then, because no one is proposing children have that discussed with them. But let's get to the absolute crux of this. You worry that your child will in some way be indoctrinated into gayness, that they will in some way hear about it. You use the word yourself, recruit, that they'll hear about the existence of gay people and that this is all part of some perhaps master plan so that children hear about gay people so that more children can be recruited. I mean, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that you can almost, it sounds like you believe you can catch gay, like it's airborne, like it's a virus?
I think there are behavioral factors. I think there are environmental factors. I do not think it is genetic. I think children are not...
Many scientists disagree with you, but go on.
Well, if you point to the scientific studies done by Kinsey here in America in the 1960s, 50s and 60s.
50s and 60s, eh? Right. I just thought we might have come on a bit since then, but go on.
Well, when the...
No, go on. Finish your answer. But do you genuinely... So you think you can catch it? You think people in repressed places in the world, like Uganda or Iran or Saudi Arabia, those children of completely heterosexual parents who've never heard about the existence of gay people in their lives, who actually find themselves in a situation where they have same-sex attraction in a country where they will be killed for it, you believe those people have caught it or decided as a choice to engage in that?
Well, if you look at a comparison of, let's say, the children of heterosexuals, there's less than 1% chance they will become gay. Well, but the children of homosexuals, the adult children of homosexuals, if two lesbians raise a boy, there is up to 20% chance that he will become gay. So is it genetic? I
don't believe that research. I don't believe that research. I think because I've seen research that absolutely contradicts that. BBC Question Time have come under fire for asking the question whether they believe it's morally right for these lessons to take place in schools. Many people feeling that the question itself is quite inappropriate because they feel that an issue like this would not be taken as seriously and not be perhaps indulged as much as it is if there was another minority that was being protested, because of course these lessons do cover all sorts of different minorities, different faiths, different religions and the like, and different races, and they are all taught in the context of being equal. And but it is of course just the LGBT element that many of the parents involved here are protesting. Last week we spoke about this from the perspective of someone from the Christian faith who would have protested these lessons. Let's now talk live to Ahsan Ahmedi, who is the spokesperson for the London Ahmediyya Muslim Association. Morning to you, Ahsan.
Good morning, Cristo. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us this morning here on Talk Radio. Why do these parents, who are mainly of the Islamic faith, but I know that they've received support from other faiths as well, why do they object to these relationships being discussed in school in the wider context of equality?
Thanks for clarifying that it's not just a Muslim issue. There are many faiths who also object to this as well.
No, I mean, it is fair to say it is a majority Muslim in Birmingham, most definitely.
In Birmingham, sure, and they're probably making the most noise. But if it's coming to other schools also, there would be others also protesting. I know.
So, and what is the problem with those lessons?
But I'll tell you what. For me, I think the biggest problem was that the parents were never consulted, and I think that was the biggest mistake that was made. But I think the other issue for me is that I was looking at the national statistics. There are 120,000 same-sex couples with children in England. This is from the National Statistics Register. There are 12.4 million married couple families and 2 million single-parent families. So if you equate that, this is 0.8% of the population of the United Kingdom, right? So it's a very, very, very minute population to whom this is being catered for. Now, you mentioned about the question time discussing this subject, right? Now, last Thursday, not this Thursday, but last Thursday, question time did not discuss the New Zealand bombing in the subject at all 1 week after the incident. And yet this finds space on question time to be discussed. So
and actually, I accept, actually, and I'll go on to tell you that, because I accept the really precarious balancing act, I think, that especially British Muslims face. Actually, let me just finish. Between sort of perhaps, as there is with any faith, the more extreme interpretations of that faith and living a life of British values. I really appreciate, I think a lot of people perhaps don't appreciate the balancing act that a lot of British Muslims need to make in that sense, and a lot of the discrimination that perhaps they face. But then on that subject, I can't help but feel, and I accept your point about the consultation on this, and perhaps it wasn't carried out in the best possible way. But the first thing I'll say is that I don't believe that these lessons are just to cater to the children of same-sex couples. They're actually to cater for the children as well of the 12 million couples, as you described, who are heterosexual parents, because of course those children are going to go on in their lives to encounter LGBT people. So therefore they are simply being told a fact that LGBT people exist. They don't need to have LGBT parents to be told that fact.
Listen, I've got no issue with this subject being discussed at school, but at a certain age. I think the primary school level is where the issue is. I mean, do we discuss, intimate sex education for 5-year-olds? A 5-year-old.
No. I'm not going to. I'm not going to let you get away. You're being factually incorrect, because it's not sex education for 5-year-olds. Because of course, no one would accept a non-parental consultation for sex education for 5-year-olds. This is not sex education for 5-year-olds.
Right, but this is another aspect of relationships for 5-year-olds, which at that 5-year-old, now, are you going to let me make the point?
Yes, go on. No, I'm agreeing. Go on. Please do go on.
That a 5-year-old or children at primary school, they do not have any racial bias, they do not have any religious bias, they do not have any sexual bias in their thought process. They see a friend, they'll play with them irrespective of what color they are. It's only when they get older when they start building up these biases, right? Now, for me, I think it would have been far better for this sort of subject to be discussed at secondary school when they're about 10 or 11-year-old, rather than at 5-year-old. I think that's where the issue is. So,
but do you object to them being taught about any relationships at 5, because that's not what's being protested here. These parents aren't protesting any relationship being discussed. They're only protesting the LGBT relationships being discussed.
Only because at that age, the parents who have brought the children to this country, to Earth, they have a duty to and a role in upbringing of their children. And they would bring them up in their values. Now, beyond that, the school does, of course, help influence and help the children to learn other things. So, So for me, at primary school level, at children level, that responsibility in the main should remain with the parents. Obviously, the outside, the secular education should be done by the school, and the parent will still play a role. But at secondary level, of course, I will not be on the radio.
I'm really sorry to say, though, and perhaps you don't realise it, that's a homophobic stance, because if you don't, I'm going to explain. I'm going to explain to you.
I'm going to explain to you. Homosexuality at all.
No, well, it's LGBT, and so it's a discriminatory stance against the LGBT community. Let me explain to you why that is. Let me explain to you why that is. The LGBT community are across the United Kingdom, and the children in these schools will encounter them. I have nieces and nephews. I know people from the LGBT community. Myself, I'm from the LGBT community. My niece, nephew, people I know from the age of 3, 4, 5 years of age have had no issue whatsoever in encountering relationships that involve the same gender or different genders. But the thing that is discriminatory is that there is no objection to the other items on this lesson on equality that are being objected to. And I don't understand, unless it's rooted in homophobia, I cannot think of a reason why any parent would object to their child just being given the basic fact, which it is that LGBT people exist, the basic fact, which it is that LGBT people enjoy the same equality. Those are the only facts being given to the children. Can you give me a reason why that would be objected to that can't be seen as homophobic?
Well, it is not homophobic, I can tell you that. Look, Islam is a religion which does not accept homosexuality as the right way of doing it. That's a religious belief, and many religious beliefs have that. So there's not homophobic about it.
The other religious beliefs that have that are homophobic as well. It's not just Islam. The Christian belief is homophobic by saying that as well, by saying it's sinful.
Cristo, you got to let me speak as well. There are many things in society which aren't part of other faiths, or which are part of faith, which are not part of society, etc. And these are not brought to the core or to the fore of school education. So what I'm trying to say here is that for a 0.08%, this is getting over subscribed attention for a very minute. Children will grow up with, whether a girl or a boy has got 2 moms or 2 dads, they will not question it. So why are we trying to push it on to them?
And what do you think would be the harm of children hearing about that?
Let me finish the point.
Okay, go on.
When they get to an age where they start to understand this, which will be mostly from secondary school education, because that's when they start learning about what religion is and all these sort of things are. Even when I was teaching my kids the moral values of Islam at a young age, they weren't really understanding the religion. They were only understanding some moral question, right? So therefore, we don't need to push this on to the children at a young age. Let that be discussed at an age when they start to mature a bit, start to understand things. And that's the point I'm making.
Yeah, but that is homophobic. I'm sorry. Religion is actually discussed. I know, I've let you speak enough and give your... And I've also allowed you to give that...
finish my point.
I've allowed you to give that statistic again of 0.8%, like it's a valid statistic, when, of course, across the whole of the United Kingdom, there are way more than 0.8% of people that are LGBT. So you act like it's just lessons for the parents of who are LGBT. That is not the case. You have to stop making that point. Otherwise, I will interrupt you.
Well, it's a national register figure.
Of LGBT parents, but these lessons are not just for the children of LGBT parents. These lessons are for all children to hear about the existence of LGBT people.
No, it is not about LGBT people. It's about LGBT parents. This is what
one of the reasons is because in the original class where this took place, two sets of the parents are LGBT, and that was why it was then referenced as a reason why it was important in that class. I'm asking you about the wider conversation about why, if religions are being discussed, if races are being discussed, and if heterosexual relationships are being discussed, why, in the context of all of those things, I don't think anyone would ever dream of having lessons about equality where religions are mentioned and the religion of Islam being removed from that, because that would be discriminatory.
Yeah, but again, it's giving a lot of attention. Like I mentioned, like in questions I didn't even bother to discuss the New Zealand killings.
That's got nothing to do with this.
No. You mentioned in the opening that it was discussed on Question Time about this subject, LGBTQ, on Question Time. I'm making the point that there are far more serious things in life, and the BBC doesn't cover those sometimes. And the point that you were making earlier with me is that Muslim communities are getting discriminated or having to deal with such situations. This is just adding to that. So, listen.
Well, absolutely. Well, then why don't they stop protesting? Why don't they stop protesting? Then no one would mind.
Yeah, sure. At the end of the day, parents who feel uncomfortable with teaching this because of their faith or whatever it is, and there will be Christians and other faiths included in that, what will they do? They might start pulling out their kids out of school and do home education, which many parents do anyway without for any other reason whatsoever. So you might find that rather than using the school, the government education system, they will start going and opening their own schools, which I am actually against. I'm against faith schools.
Well, I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say, but the very parents who are objecting to this, and let's just level with each other here, they want the opportunity to tell their children that living and enacting an LGBT lifestyle is sinful. And they are worried that if the children hear about it in a context of equality and in a context of it not being sinful, those children are not going to have the opinions that being LGBT is wrong. And ultimately, that's what those parents want those children to think. That is homophobic.
No, Cristo, look.
Am I right or am I wrong about them wanting them to hear about it being sinful? Is that right or wrong?
No, listen. It's not a case of answering yes or no to that question.
But it is. Is it seen as a sin in your religion?
It's not. I'm sorry, you're wrong. It's not. And let me give you my answer. My answer is this, that many parents bring up their children with their faith values, whatever they are, right? But when children get to an age of maturity, they start making their own decisions about the religion. And many kids, do not follow the religion of their parents they are taught, okay? And this will happen the same on this subject as well.
Yeah, but that's actually not answered my question. Is it seen as sinful?
The point I'm making is that kids will start understanding these relationships.
Is it seen as sinful?
By the school education. No, that's irrespective. There are many things that all religions teach which might be contrary to people who are not religious people.
But is it? But I'm sorry, no. Okay, what else would you consider as sinful then, as being a member of the LGBT community, that you wouldn't want your children to hear about in school?
Listen, I told you the whole life stuff of LGBTQ is contrary to Islamic teaching, is contrary to Christian
teaching. Because it's sinful. Because it's sinful.
For whatever reason, that's the religious belief.
So of course those parents are going to tell their children it's sinful. Of course they are.
So they're always going to.
Well, that's homophobic. That's homophobic to suggest to someone. I'm sorry, no. I'm sorry, you need to hear this. You need to hear this. Well, I'm sorry, you can't at the beginning of this conversation tell me about how, which I agree with, British Muslims are the victims of Islamophobia, and then at the end of this conversation shrug your shoulders and say, well, homophobia exists. We all have to live with it. I tell you what, if these parents don't want to be...
I did not say that.
Well, you said that's life. You just said that's life.
No, I said that's life, that children will be brought up by religious families with a particular belief, and you can't stop that. That's the point I'm making. I think you're misreading to what I'm saying, and maybe even trying to create something that I'm not saying.